Hi, I'm Phil Howard. Welcome to this installment of the Media and Change series, a series of interviews we're doing at the Center for Data, Media and Society at CEU with visiting scholars, researchers, journalists. Today I have a guest, Anya Schiffrin, who's here on a book tour, and I'm going to ask a few questions about her book and some of her research on Vietnam. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So you're here primarily to talk about global muckraking. And tell us about the collection. I know it's got some 43 entries?
Yeah, global muckraking, and the muckrakers were, of course, American journalists who exposed corporate misdoing around the turn of the last century, is a collection of journalism from developing countries over the last 150 years. It has 47 pieces of journalism introduced by 40 different scholars and activists and journalists. And it's about the different campaigns that journalists ran, sometimes with NGOs, to right wrongdoing around the world. So we have sections on labor, on slavery, on police brutality, environment, natural disasters, famine, and food shortages, as well as anti-colonialism, women, and rural affairs.
And were you predisposed to pick examples that were successful, where there was a good impact and some positive outcome?
Well, one of the lessons of the book is that even when journalism had an effect in one place, very often the same problem would come up in a different place at a different time. So what I tried to do in the book was compare cases from around the world so that we could see the similarities and the differences. For example, many people are surprised to know that in 1906 there was a boycott of Cadbury's chocolate over labor conditions in Sao Tome and Principe. So I have a piece about Cadbury's chocolate next to a piece from 2008 from Fortune magazine about conditions in the cocoa plantations in West Africa. I have a piece on labor conditions in Nike factory in Indonesia in the 1980s, next to a piece about Liz Claiborne in the sweatshops in South America, and a piece about the conditions in the Foxconn factory in China more recently.
And how do your more recent entries, say the entries written since journalists had access to digital media or were publishing online, how do those more recent entries differ from the print or the offline form?
One real difference is that in the 19th century it took a really long time to get stories out and to verify them. So it took the Cadburys about 8 years to figure out whether or not there was really terrible labor conditions in Sao Tome and Principe. Nowadays it's much faster. As I say in the book, news travels faster now, even if it's ignored when it arrives. So it's much easier to document wrongdoing and to expose it and to disseminate information about it than it was before the internet.
And in your experience, how do citizen journalists feature in this, or do they feature at all?
This book, we really had citizen journalists in the 19th century, actually. Many of the people that started newspapers or magazines in the 19th century did so because they saw an outrage and they wanted to expose it. So they published a newspaper or magazine for 8 years or 5 years, and then they stopped. So in that sense, the publications of the 19th century remind me a lot of what we see today. Also, many of the old newspapers were really like blogs. They're very personal. They had lots of funny stories in them. The difference, of course, was that it was harder to produce these materials and much, much harder to disseminate them than it is today. What we see today, of course, is that it's far more easy to produce information, much harder to actually get anybody's attention.
And I imagine many of your early entries were from people who were also writing fiction.
Yes, that's right. Sometimes they were writing fiction, sometimes they were business people who just got outraged and decided to set up a newspaper. Sometimes they were pamphleteers. In one case we have a pamphlet that was written by a missionary about foot binding in China. So they weren't always journalists, but many often actually they were. Yeah.
Can I switch you to Vietnam?
Yeah,
well, I know you worked there for several years.
And this is actually a very good segue because digital media has really transformed the media climate in Vietnam. Before the internet, it was a very, very closed media system with virtually every newspaper, radio station and magazine or any kind of publication owned by some part of the government or the Communist Party. And there were some newspapers that were trying to do more exposés, maybe more labor reporting, although they'd often get beaten back, and expose corruption. But the internet has turned out to really be a boom because what's happened partly in Vietnam is that people who write for official media, at night they go and blog. So there's been a very lively blogging culture there, which has done a lot to expose corruption in the Prime Minister's family. So what we saw a couple of years ago was massive blogging and massive online sort of activism about corruption and about the government. And this sometimes would translate into people taking to the streets as well, such as what we saw last year with the anti-Chinese protests. So the internet's been important there. It's different from other places. It's really all about Facebook. Facebook is officially banned, but Facebook is in fact what people use. And pretty much everybody uses Facebook there. The big companies will use it and regular people too.
So are you saying the ban doesn't work, or the government can't enforce it, or people have people have figured the workaround?
Basically hadn't bothered enforcing it in many cases. So Vietnam Airlines, state-owned company, has a website, has a URL, and directs people to it in their official media. In the beginning, it was really Yahoo that was popular, but now I would say it's pretty much Facebook. So we're not seeing the same kinds of microblogs that we're seeing in China, although that may change. Last time I was there, which was March, it was still really Facebook.
And have you seen any encroachment of the Chinese equivalents, right? So the Chinese Weibo and the Sino Weibo and the QQ, these equivalent to the Western Facebook and Twitter. And my understanding is that China's trying to expand these tools into Southeast Asia. Did you notice much pickup, or is it culturally the Western?
I asked about it when I was there, and people really didn't seem to know about it. People still seem pretty committed to Facebook, but things change quickly, so it may well change there really fast, or may have changed already.
And in your experience, I think for some countries in the region, the most politically active people online are actually the diaspora, people not at home, or writing the most challenging political content and assembling sort of investigative pieces. But it sounds like these are Vietnamese in Vietnam writing about Vietnam.
Yeah, the overseas Vietnamese community, which was exiled or became refugees after the end of the war, and many of them were boat people, they've always had newspapers and magazines out in California, for example, that have talked about how terrible Vietnam is. I remember the first week we got the internet in Vietnam, one of the Vietnamese men in my office immediately called up a website with the South Vietnamese flag on it. Those controls were immediately put in, so you couldn't do that anymore. But I would say that the use of Facebook for political purposes in Vietnam right now and to expose corruption is being done by the Vietnamese who are there, which isn't to say they don't, of course, have contact with friends and family overseas, because they do.
Because they would. And do you think Facebook then is, may also be helping to bridge the cultural gap between the Vietnamese in Vietnam and the ones who left? Or are those cultures still pretty distinct?
That's a really good point. I would say absolutely. And one of the things is that Vietnamese students who come to the United States use Facebook to find students who are already here, or to find American Vietnamese who are already here.
And so they reconnect with family.
Very much, well, the other thing is because there's so few last names in Vietnam, that if you do a search for the last name Nguyen, you can pretty much find a Vietnamese person wherever you are. So I know plenty of Vietnamese students who come to the States, and the first thing they do is they go into the search engine at their university and they type in Nguyen, and they find the other 3 Vietnamese kids there. They find people and become friends with them.
Nice.
So,
Well, thank you very much. My guest today has been Anya Schiffrin, author of Global Muckraking, for the series Media and Change at the Center for Media, Data and Society. Thank you for joining us.